Hello. Unmute. I can't hear you speak.
Hi.
Hello, how are you?
Doing pretty good.
We have one more person that's supposed to be joining us. So if you don't mind, we can just kind of get started and go through, and you can be our amazing guest tonight. How's that?
Okay.
No? Hello, everyone. This is Opus Night, and you have entered Night Vision. We have Kristen Joy Allison. And how are you this evening?
I'm doing pretty good.
Good. And you are an author?
Yep, I am an author of 4 books.
Wonderful. So can you show us your latest?
So the latest is the one behind me, but I do have another copy here. It's Infinitus, which is book 1 of the Infinitus saga.
That is beautiful.
Yeah. So there is a prelude novelette that was released before it, but it's not a full novel, so it's not considered book 1. It's the Global Fellowship. It's just a prelude. I'm going to introduce you to the story and get your feet wet.
And what type of book is it?
So it's a cyberpunk, which is a futuristic dystopian sci-fi where there's a global or regional, in this case, global computer system that kind of manages day-to-day life and folks interact with it and whatnot. So
I love it. That's awesome. And how long have you been writing?
So I've been writing professionally since the end of 2016. That's when I started writing. That's when I started writing Infinitus, and then I kind of published 3 books before Infinitus was fully ready and finished, and then Infinitus was released finally this year. So
amazing. Now, do you write poetry, short stories, or do you write novels exclusively?
So I write a combination of everything. I do some fiction, I do nonfiction. In addition to being an author, I'm also a criminal justice reform activist. So I do a lot of nonfiction as well. But I don't have any books published in nonfiction yet, mostly blogs and whatnot. And I also, 2 of the books that I've published are children's picture books, actually.
Really?
Yeah.
Do you have any of those that you could show us or tell us about?
I do. So the first one was called Why Can't Uncle Come Home? It was the first children's picture book in the world, to my knowledge, ever written on the subject of wrongful conviction for young children who are struggling with one. And then the sequel to that is Timmy and Kate Go to Visit, which is rightful, wrongful, it doesn't matter. It's for any child that's going through a prison visitation experience. To try to give them an idea of what to expect and get them comfortable and make that experience as positive as it can be.
Now, how hard or easy do you find it to write about what you do every day?
So the writing part is pretty easy. For me, the stories just kind of land on me, and then I just run with them. I'm definitely a pantser. I tend to see the story as a whole picture and then just kind of write it out as I go. I think that the thing that surprised me the most was that when I had Why Can't Uncle Come Home kind of land on me, and I had this manuscript and I cranked it out, I foolishly thought that publishing a children's picture book would be easier to start with.
Yeah, I've heard that before.
Right, because you think, well, it's shorter and I can get the manuscript done. It's like, no, it is nowhere near.
It's a win-win.
Right, it is its own beast. So yeah, that was part of my learning curve in the beginning, was getting those ones out and whatnot. But I'm pretty proud of the picture books because they're specifically for kids that are affected by what they call the adverse childhood experience of incarceration. You know, when I pitched the Why Can't Uncle Come Home the very first time to somebody from the industry, I know the response that I got was, you know, well, that's a little dark for children. And I was like, they're going through this, whether you think that it's dark for them or not. So that's actually an intentional choice to leave those kids with no resources. And I was like, well, I'm not going to put up with that. So I made it.
It's amazing. I love it. I absolutely love it. So are the children, have you had a children base that you find as fans or readers or their parents they get in touch with you and are like, you know, Timmy's going through this. Do you have any kind of helpful advice for the family or for him?
Well, I've definitely had some reviews that are that way. Like I just read this with my 6-year-old grandson, and you know, it was very helpful for him. I've had some reach out to me through social media, which I really appreciate. And I've had a lot of suggestions as far as like additional books in the series and things that can be addressed. But it is something that I have personal experience with. All of my books have to have something to do with my personal life experience. And so my husband was wrongfully convicted in 2015. And these 2 books were created based off of watching the kiddos in my own life actually go through that struggle and trying to figure out how to answer their questions, and, you know, being surprised by what their questions even were, because they're children. They don't ask the same questions or have the same fears that we do as adults.
Right.
And then my novel series and my novelette, those are influenced by the genetic disease that I have called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And so the main characters in those books have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and it's written in first person present tense so that it's pulling you into the experience of living in a chronically ill body like that. So, so yeah, I really enjoy bringing aspects of that to the reader, especially if there's somebody that is either learning about it, that doesn't know about it and doesn't have that experience, or somebody that's like, yes, that's me, this is what I've been living. So that really makes me happy.
See, I think you're a wonderful spokesperson for both. I love it. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Anything that you can write that is not only going to touch people and be compelling, the story itself, but when you can make a difference, that is what I think is the most impactful, and just it's like an epiphany that the person is like, there's other people like me. Oh my God. Because isolation is one of, you know, I know with the pandemic, a lot of people, oh, this, you know, I feel isolated. Well, there's people who feel this way every day of their life.
Right.
Pandemic, no pandemic, you know?
Right.
And I think you're amazing.
Thank you.
Truly, I do. And I deal with a lot of, well, I shouldn't even say but my daughter goes through a lot of issues, health issues. My daughter-in-law, like we have a lot of family who have had a lot of health issues. And do you find that it's how do you kind of find yourself navigating that path to be able to sit down and write, even on the days that you know you can't, you're just overwhelmed, you don't feel good? How do you deal with that dynamic in itself?
I think for me, I end up writing in chunks. Like I'll have periods of time where I'm doing really well and I can crank out a ton of words in a very short period of time. Or, you know, on the inverse, you know, when I had the flu a couple of years ago during Nano was one of my most productive periods because I couldn't get out of bed. All that I could do was sit there and write. And I know that for me, one of the reasons that I switched into writing professionally full time was because I was employed by my state, and I hit a point with my disability where I couldn't keep doing it. I couldn't keep going. I'd been faking it for so long. And, you know, all of my stopgaps and all of my supports were kind of yanked out from under me when my husband was wrongfully convicted. And it was like, well, I can't keep doing this. So, but I realized that no matter what, as long as I could speak, because I use Dragon Naturally Speaking also, as long as I could still speak, I could still write.
Right.
And if nothing else, you know, writing these stories is kind of a way to either escape from what's going on with your body or simultaneously to actually describe it. Like I had one point where I was having a really severe fibromyalgia attack, which if you don't know what that is, it basically is like your nervous system being on fire.
Right.
And there's an incredible amount of pressure, and it's something that no matter how you move or how you lay, it makes no difference at all. It's just going to be in that constant pain state. And I remember I was like, well, my character is going to have this eventually. So I sat down and I just wrote out like everything I was feeling and everything that was happening in my body and that I was going through. And that's one of the scenes in the book, is her having this just absolutely unmanageable attack that she's having to deal with in the middle of all the rest of the story going on. So yeah, I've kind of found that I navigate through both. I like to, I'm a writer that writes emotionally. So when I'm going through something, I will sit down and I will write a scene that has that similar vein and that similar emotion going on, whether it's, you know, on the good side or the negative side or whatever. And that I really like that when that connects with readers. I remember I had a story I was writing a couple of years ago, and I had this just horrifically bad day. And I've had some pretty bad days, but I had this horrifically bad day, and I sat down and I cranked out this scene, and I sent it to my sister, and she hadn't seen it for, you know, I think 5 or 6 weeks had gone by. She hadn't gotten a chance to read it. And the next thing I know, I get this ping on my phone, and she says, "I'm going to go drink a bottle of wine and take a bath because I've been crying for 30 minutes." And it's terrible, but I was like, yes, I love that. Like, I love it when it connects and when it carries
Definitely.
through. So, yeah.
And does there come a time where there's something that you will not write about, where like it becomes too emotional or too close to home?
So the only thing that I've run into on that vein is my memoir, which I am in the process of beginning to tackle, because my memoir is very, very difficult. I lost a child, and as a result of losing a child, my husband was wrongfully convicted on junk science accusations. So you can imagine there is a huge amount of super, super difficult stuff. And there was a lot of trauma, and I was attacked by police. So I had a lot of PTSD, and things like that, where I've written bits and pieces and fits and starts here and there, but I haven't really tackled the monster yet. But I've got a couple grants out there, and that I'm applying for, and I've got a couple things that I'm like, okay, I've structured it, I've figured it out, and I do plan on tackling it within the next year or two. But I'm just going to have to take it a bite at a time.
Well, just my opinion, I think you're an incredible person, and I'm very pleased to meet you.
I'm happy to meet you too. Thank you. I'm excited to be on the show. So
I'm glad. Now, you said your husband you and your husband had dealt with some difficulties. Now, with you being on one side of the law with your job, and then having dealing with you know, his convictions, or I don't even know if he was convicted, or however his term or whatnot went, however the case went, did you find it very hard where you were kind of being torn back and forth, or how did you guide through that?
yeah, so it's been a very long process, and it's not over. My husband was wrongfully convicted in 2015, but our daughter passed away in 2008. So that gives you an idea of how long it took just for us to even get to the first trial point. And then he was wrongfully incarcerated for 4.5 years, and his case was overturned in 2019, the end of 2019. So I know, like, when COVID started and all this stuff was going on, most people were just wrecked by it. But I was like, I'm on cloud 9. I don't know about you people, but my husband is home. Like, I'm great.
I don't care what else happens. I gotcha.
Right. I'm doing good. But yeah, it's been really difficult, but it was a lot of years. It was an incredible amount of years that have gone by. And the thing I found the most was that it was mostly a professional thing, as far as like what I could and couldn't talk about, and what I could and couldn't, you know, and especially because so many people that professionally knew what was happening to me, because it was very public.
That's my point. I just can't, in my head, I'm like, okay, how do you separate the two? You know, you kind of have to stand back on a lot of it and be like, I kind of got to let the chips fall and then see where they lay, and can I pick the pieces back up?
One of the things I was happy about was that even though I worked for a section of the state government, I worked for the Post-Secondary Education Commission for my state. And they were very gracious. They understood what was happening. They were very supportive of me. And so whether I had to be at court or I had other things that I had to deal with, they were just very understanding. And I would not have made it as far as I did if it wasn't for that support. But, you know, once I hit a point where I could no longer work, it kind of became moot. And that was also kind of freeing, because it was like, well, now I can talk about whatever I want, and now I can go talk to whoever I want. And, you know, and I can, I can handle this. So
now, how far along in the children's series? You have 2 books in the children's.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Now, have you actually went to schools? Where do you kind of perform like reading, having them read, or do you just sell those for personal?
At this point, I've had the opportunity. It's a hard one to get reads for.
Yeah, I kind of wondered how that fed, you know.
But I did have one opportunity locally where they were having a young writers conference for elementary kids. And they wanted authors to come in and do a session with the kiddos and read their book to them. And I was specifically working with second graders, because I had done that with my other job for years. I had volunteered for one of our events where you went in and you read to second graders. So I remember I was really super nervous, because you don't know, like, you're in a room full of parents and kids, and like, you don't know how everybody's going to react. You don't know, you know, what opinions they might have or biases they might have. And I was reading my first one, the first one on wrongful conviction. And I read the story, and I talked to the kids about how you make a book. And we went through a whole bunch of stuff. And then at the end, I had a parent that pulled me aside, and they were just crying. And they were crying, and I was like, you know, and they were like, thank you so much. And I was like, well, you're welcome, you know. And they said, we have a friend that's been missing for 2 years, and we just found out that this is what happened to them. And I had no idea how to talk to my daughter about it. And it was like, oh, it just breaks your heart. Every time I hear one of these stories, it trashes me for a while, but but it's worth it. I mean, that's why I created it. So. Right.
And with the parents, you don't get a lot of backlash that this subject is, as you said, too dark?
No, so far I haven't. But that's largely because of how it's written. You know, it's not written the way you would talk to an adult. It's written the way that you would talk to a child. And so in the story, Timmy ends up in this situation where, you know, he kind of watches his uncle go through this and is upset by it. And you get to see him go through all of those emotions. Then at some point, you know, when he asks his mom, why can't Uncle come home? She reminds him of a story of a time that a vase was broken, and he blamed his sister Kate, because he knew that he wasn't the culprit. He didn't do it, you know, but so he blames Kate for it. And then, you know, she explains that Kate hadn't really done it. It was just that the vase had been broken on its own. You know, and he was thankful that Mama knew that it wasn't Kate's fault, but it makes the same parallel that, you know, sometimes adults are blamed for things that they didn't do too. You know, and it also kind of gives that impression too about, like, that's why you don't say that somebody did something you didn't see them do. Right. You know, it kind of puts in these important influences early for a child. But it, you know, it brings it down to a very simple level. And I think that when I've seen their reactions to it, it's very basic and it's very understandable. And there's not a lot to argue with about that, because a lot of people know more and more that, you know, wrongful conviction is an unfortunate fact in our society. Yeah. You know,
definitely.
Yeah.
Now with you being able to write the other book that you have,
Infinitive?
Yes.
Yes.
How do you go from children's book to that? Give me like this idea of how you go, okay, I wrote about these characters here, and then all of a sudden now I can get real in this book as far as you know, everything from the dialogue to the syntax of the story itself.
Right.
You know, it's kind of a different spectrum.
It's
So
very
I'm
different.
intrigued.
And for me, the key in it is that I actually started writing infinitus first. And then to a large extent, I wrote them simultaneously. And I'm a writer that I'm influenced very heavily by voice. So I can read a bunch of children's picture books. I can absorb a lot of that information, and I can just, when I tell the story, it just comes more naturally the way that you would talk to a child, versus when I write other kinds of stories, when I write my fiction like this, I'm a novel person, and I'm not even like one of those 50,000 word novel people. Like infinitus is 150,000 words. Like
Beautiful.
it's a tome. So and infinitus is designed to be part of a 4-part series, four novels. That's just the first place that I could cut the story and have somebody not string me up for where I left them. So
now, with dialogue, how do you do the dialogue for the children's books? And do you have a specific way that you have to kind of, like you said, you're a pantser, not a plotter so much. So how do you start writing and then kind of run with the story?
Yes, I live with the dialogue. I know there's kind of two types, in whether you're a plotter or a pantser.
Right.
But there's also two types when it comes to, are you dialogue or are you like setting and description? I am not a setting and description person. I have to go back and layer all of that in and go, okay, you know, I need to not have a floating head here. I need to have whatever. But I live in the conversation between characters. It is my absolute favorite thing. That's what I read. That's what I write. I write relationships between characters and how they're struggling and how they're evolving and how they're getting through the process and whether they're coming out the other side intact or not. And so a lot of times when I sit down, I focus on the conversations that are happening, and those moments are what draw me in. And then I paint the full picture around it kind of as a secondary stage.
Now, what do you find the hardest to write? Like what will stump you for a minute where you're like, oh God, I hate this part of it? Is it the editing? Is it coming up with like a prologue or the backstory, or what part of it just kind of, you know, grind your gears, so to speak?
Right. So I do an incredibly heavy amount of editing on my work. It's edited from the beginning to the end umpteen times before it comes out. But I have an incredible editor that I work with personally. And so they can kind of keep me grueling through that process. And I'll go, yes, I acknowledge it's crap. I'll fix it. But
I know I'm responsible.
Right. But I think the part that really stumps me, if there's anything that stumps me, is because I'm a pantser and I'm writing these sagas, right, that have a lot of characters and there's a huge amount of stuff going on, both that you can see and that you can't. The difficulty with this particular series for me is that it's written in first person. And there's two main points of view. There's two main characters that you're kind of bouncing back and forth between. And but if I'm not writing from the perspective of those two characters, then they don't know what else is going on behind the scenes. That's part of the suspense of the story, is that they have no idea what's going on. But the problem is that because I'm a pantser, I don't know either. So I will hit certain points in certain stages where I don't understand what's going to happen next, and I won't even realize why I'm stuck. But almost every time when I go back and when I think about it, or when I talk to my editor and go, I don't know what to do, it's like, oh, well, I have to know what so-and-so is doing behind the scenes before I'm going to know where they can even go next. And so I have to write that scene that's not even going to show up in the book, but I have to write it from that other character's perspective so that I know what's happening.
Now, have you ever taken a character and written them, like you love the character and then you're like, I'm sorry, you have to die. You have got to die. Like, I have done that. I don't want to say a lot, but a lot, because I have certain characters that you love them the whole way through, and then you realize you're not as main a character as where the story's kind of delving into. And I will kind of start writing them out, and then I'm like, you know what, it's just time to die. Do you have characters that you have literally loved all the way, that have carried you all the way, and then you're like, all right, good night?
I don't think I have yet. I certainly haven't had that with this book. I think with this book, what I've discovered more of is that, again, because I'm a pantser, but I have this like full, like 4-book series, like in my mind, I have the general state of affairs in my head. What I discovered more of was that I started writing the sequel to this one, which is called Chimera Rising, before Infinitus was ever finished.
Mm.
And it was, you know, it was drafted, and I had to go through all the edits and all that kind of stuff, but I just had to keep going. I had to jump ahead. And so I wrote about 50,000 words into the sequel. And I had this epiphany where it was like, oh my gosh, these 2 or 3 characters are really important in the next book. So I need to make sure that they're set up correctly in the first book. Because otherwise I'm shooting myself in the foot. So
this is not uncommon.
Right.
And I have to say, you know, I've had parts where I have literally forgotten something that I have written. And all of a sudden throughout, it's just like the characters remembered, and they're like, okay, and the story will kind of just travel right back to that point. And oh, this feeds right into where I was, you know, that part that I didn't know that I had forgotten.
Right, exactly.
It's beautiful. I love when that happens. Love when that happens. And I literally thank them. I'm like, oh God, thank you so much. At least you guys were paying attention.
Right. And I think like I had this major epiphany too about one of my main characters well into the second book. And that was where, I don't know if you know about if you've ever heard of the 5 love languages before. But I am, it's basically, to summarize it very, very simply, it communicates that everybody communicates love, or like that sensation, and they feel it based off of 5 different categories, 5 different types. And so whether that's receiving or giving gifts, or whether it's physical touch, or whether it's words of affirmation, like it basically says like, this is how people interpret what love is. And it's also the source of a huge amount of conflict. So I've given some presentations before on how you can create conflict in stories by having characters that are not speaking the same language. And one is saying, I love you, and the other is saying, you're guilt tripping me. What is this issue? And so, but when I was well into the second book, it was like, it hit me all of a sudden what one of my love languages was for one of my characters. And I was like, oh, this is why you have so many issues. But it makes so much more sense now. And like, as I went back through, I realized I could see that through the whole story, that that's what was one of the things that was going wrong with this character, that they were having so much trouble dealing with, but I hadn't clued into the fact that that's what was going on.
Yeah, it's like that little epiphany you have yourself. You're like, oh my God, this character's really screwed up. You know, right. you all of a sudden like just realize this. And now, as far as the children's books, are you going to support them? As far as, can we let our readers know where we can find you to get in touch with you?
Oh, absolutely.
If, say, a school or some institution wants you to come and speak?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Anybody can get a hold of me through AllisonPublishing.com. So it's just my last name, AllisonPublishing.com. And you can get a hold of me through there. I'm also all over social media. I'm on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and LinkedIn. Yeah, you know, contact me, and I'm totally open for doing, you know, getting the kids' books in everywhere that I can. I know that libraries are actually one of the groups that are excited about it. I know our local library, when I called and I was like, would you or would you not carry this? They're like, we will like hardback bind it ourselves if you can't make it in hardback, because they said, we have been desperate for that book for years and nobody's ever written it. And so one of the processes that I've done recently was gone through and I don't know if you know about cataloging, but I had my books cataloged so that the libraries could carry them without going through that horrific process of getting them cataloged. And so they're now cataloged and available through Ingram Spark, and it's much easier if somebody wants to go in and request that your local library carry the book. They'll be able to do that really easy now. So
now, have you actually considered, just on a personal note, have you ever considered actually going to like the courthouse and saying, look, I am a writer and I just wanted to know if you have any clients that are going through such and such, you know, and have children, maybe you might want to just let them be aware. I mean, because I know even with family court, I know years ago, I had written poetry, and I had a friend that actually she had come home from family court, and she was like, oh my God, that poem you wrote absolutely made my day. And I'm like, well, good, honey, I was happy. And then she goes, no, you don't understand. I made more friends and learned more things in like 5 minutes after I read that thing out loud. I thought to myself, other people heard. And the next thing I know, she said it was like a chain reaction. We all got into a general conversation. She said, and the conversation was completely about what your poetry was, you know, your poem was. And I was like, that's a gift from God. That's
so awesome.
I can say that is just like serendipitous, absolutely beautiful. I love it. You know? So please make sure that you do go through certain channels, because I think that is amazing. I think you are amazing. And I so appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you. Yeah, I have connected with the Innocence Network community. And so I have, they were very gracious, and they actually gave me a table one year to have my book there so that everybody could see it. And it was when the second one was coming out. And so I was able to connect with that group. I did a book tour across the United States where I tried to hit every Innocence project that I could manage on the way through, because I had to cross the United States anyway. And so I just hit as many projects as I could. And I know that there's a lot of defense attorneys that really feel very, very helped by the story. You know, one of our defense attorneys was like, I've got kids and I didn't know how to explain to them why my job is so important. Like, you know, because they're cast in such a negative light so much of the time, but it's like, these are the people standing between you and complete and total chaos and injustice. Like, these people are absolutely critical. So yeah, I want to get in connection with a lot of those organizations across the US and just let people know that it's out there, because those people are the ones that are going to know who's in that situation.
Right. Exactly. So I do ask, please keep in touch and come join us again whenever you'd like. We'd be happy to have you.
All righty.
Everyone, that is our show. And like I said, this was Christine Joy Allison. And if you would like to get in touch with her, please go to her website. This is Night Vision, and I thank you very much. You have a beautiful night. Bye-bye now.